Okay, so welcome to today's presentation. I wanted to get this to you guys a little bit sooner, but things got away from me this weekend, so I apologize for that. On Friday, we left off talking about Bacon's, the start of Bacon's Rebellion. We're going to circle back to that and discuss that a little bit more tomorrow because there's a lot to unpack there as it does lead a little bit into a discussion of slavery in the colonial era. So we're going to skip this portion and jump ahead to kind of talk about what life was like in two different groups of the colonies. So we've already talked about life in the Chesapeake region. We're going to talk about life today in the southern colonies. So that would be in the Carolinas and in Georgia and in New England. So we want to look at how Southern society was created. As it says on the slide here, slavery created a separate societal structure in the South that was based on wealth and hierarchy. So we're going to talk more about actual slave societies a little bit more detail tomorrow, but we'll just kind of introduce that. Obviously, at the very top of the hierarchy, at the top of the pyramid, would have been the small number of great planters. The planter families that had started coming over from the various early days of the colonies, that through the head right system of the 1 acre for 50 acres for every person you bring over, these people were able to acquire vast tracts of land in the southern society, and they owned huge tracts of land, and therefore they controlled the economic and political power of the colony. In Virginia alone, for example, now Virginia, we talked about life in there, but Virginia is also classified as a southern colony. Before the Revolution, so prior to 1775, 70% of the leaders of the colony came from families who arrived before 1690. So that tells you that these were landed interests that had lived for many, many years as British subjects, as wealthy British subjects in the empire, and had a lot to hold and gain, but something must have changed to create that desire to split. There is this great idea, this myth that surrounds how the top lived. We picture antebellum society, these beautiful houses, the big ball gowns, all those different kinds, the hoop skirts, the fancy silverware, all those good things, which they did present themselves that way. They did have the grand homes and the fine clothing and everything, the best that they could have, and they were in a way little mini British aristocrats in training. They were striving to be like the landed interest in England. However, their lifestyle was very different than what the British aristocrats were, because there was hard work in running a plantation. Now, yes, most of the actual backbreaking work, the grueling backbreaking work, was done by the slaves. But it was difficult to run a plantation. Not, again, that I'm sympathizing with the plantation owners, but just trying to put that in context here, because it cost money. It cost, if crops failed, if there was sabotage on the plantation, their livelihoods can disappear. So there are many plantations that sometimes teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. Some of the things, again, were created by the landowners themselves because they overspent on luxuries of imports from Britain. They wanted to be like the British aristocracy, so they spent like the British aristocracy, trying to get the best and newest things from Britain. Well, that cost money, and they would do that on credit depending upon the sales of their crops. So they would, plant their harvest, they would plant their crops, expect to get a harvest, and they would then buy things on that credit. Well, if they had a bad harvest that year, if the crops were poor that year, they would not have the ability to pay debt. And what would they have to do to pay the debt? They would just actually get more debt to take that on. So a lot of the Virginia planter families actually experienced significant amounts of debt as the years went on. But again, we'll get into some of that later. At the next level of Southern society, which is actually the largest, if we're talking about society in the sense of the white ownership, were the small farmers who were able to own their own smaller plots of land. And maybe if they were able to afford it, they did only have one or two slaves. So, again, when we picture slavery in the South, we picture large estates, large numbers of slaves, 50, 60, 70, over 100, sometimes 200 slaves. Again, that was for the very, very, very elites. Many of the planters would have had one or two. Again, not making that any better than what it was, because again, it was still human bondage, but just again, putting this into social context. Below the small farmers would have been the landless whites. which would have been former indentured slaves, and their number increased as time went on because the number of slaves increased. So as the number of indentured servitudes decreased with the rise of slavery, that number of landless whites dropped as well. And then at the very bottom of Southern society would have been the enslaved people themselves. In terms of cities, we already talked about this. The only major southern city would have been Charleston, located in South Carolina. Now, again, this would have been Charlestown up until the Revolution. In the Revolutionary period, they renamed it into Charleston. The lack of strong urban airways or large urban areas delayed the growth of an urban professional class. And what do I mean by urban professional class? I'm talking about people who were lawyers and financiers. So people who were the lawyers of the colonies, people who were the money men of the colonies, did not really live in the South. They lived more in the northern and New England colonies up there because that's where the towns were and that's where the business was. If you don't have towns, you don't have a need for necessarily the law structures as you would in a New York or Boston or Philadelphia in down the South. You would have them in Charleston, but not so much. Same thing with money lenders. Virginia planters would have to, and other southern planters would have to travel or do by correspondence to get their financing. The main way of transportation in the South was waterways. The roads were absolutely awful. The roads could not be traveled in the winter. And so because of this, one of the unique things that actually develops in the South is that families were actually buried together. So families were buried together on the estates, not because, again, they wanted to be close to home, but because the roads were so bad that you really couldn't transport your deceased relatives to a burial, to a cemetery, like they would have done in other parts of the colonies. And we see that in the next slide. So we see that here in this image. This is the burial plot that exists in South Carolina of the Fripp family. So the mother and the father would be buried here in this crypt, this larger area in the center here, and then the children are marked in with their graves in those four. So there are four children. They were buried in this general area. Again, they would just been what would have been unmarked graves, but they were confirmed by ground penetrating radar when archaeologists and when other historians came through. These other grave sites here are other family members who would have died later on. But you could just kind of see again, living in the South, it would have been common again to have been buried together as a family unit rather than being buried in a common cemetery. All right, shifting to life in New England. Life in New England was very different than that in the Chesapeake and the South, because in New England, they were largely blessed with clean water and cooler temperatures. Remember, the South has got very hot temperatures. The South has brackish water with the still waters. You know, the waters of the South don't really run very fast. There's not a lot of change in elevation. They're very flat. So if you don't get water stirring up, you get waterborne illnesses. You get diseases spread that way. In New England, the rivers are a little bit more rough, so you get that, and that keeps the waterborne illnesses down. Unlike the South and Chesapeake, where we said that lifespan decreased when you came over, lifespan actually increased when you moved into New England by a factor of 10 years. So those people who came over from England and settled in the colonies of New England, they actually would have lived longer than their compatriots back in the mother country. The average life expectancy for people living in New England at the time was about 70 years old. They came together as families. Again, in the Chesapeake region, families or men were the primary people. Young men in their 20s and late teens, early 20s were often those who migrated to the United States or to the colonies. In New England, it was whole family units that would come because that was the center of life. Puritan families, that was the center of their existence, and so the whole family unit would come over. That allowed for the population to grow due to birth rates. And we see this example here in this painting of Mary Merrick Davy. This woman exemplifies the longevity of New Englanders. She bore 9 children. She buried 3 husbands and was still performing household tasks past the age of 100. Now, the image that's there, the caption of it has her living for about 117 years. It's probably not that long that she lived. Dating might not have been accurate, but she did live to be well over 100 years. And again, that would have not been super common in New England, but again, an age of living to be 70 would have been the case. Okay, so life in New England would have been different from, again, in terms of life in the other colonies. Again, marriage would have taken place early in the early 20s. Women at the time would have had a baby every 2 years. And with the expectation that they would have up to 10 pregnancies with, on average, 8 children surviving. So from the age of about 20 to about 40, women would be having a baby every 2 years. And of that, you would have 8 of your children survive. And you see in this image here of a New England household, here's the mother over to the side, an older daughter at the spinning wheel. You have another daughter tying the fire. You have a baby on the ground here being tended to by an older sibling. This would have been very common. So each of the New Englanders' children would have had a particular role in their family, taking care of the other members of the household. We see this with an example of the governor of Massachusetts, Governor William Phips of Massachusetts. He was one of 27 children. All of them came from the same mother. Now, again, thinking about that, how you have 27 children in today's day and age is remarkable. But this is just one example of that, is that, again, a Puritan family, this would have been seen as not all that extraordinary, probably. So raising children was the full-time job for most mothers. Long life would have meant there was been a family stability in there. Children would have spent time in a nurturing environment, so they would have had the comfort and care of their families around them. Within that piece of nurturing, though, obedience would have been one of the key factors of that. So obedience of the family, of the parent, and certainly of God's laws would have been demanded of the children, and it would have been a rigorous life that they would have had to live. Children in New England would have known their grandparents. And so we often credit New England with inventing the concept of grandparents because, again, most people living in Europe would not have known their grandparents. Most people living in the South would not have known their grandparents. It was New England that creates this concept of of grandparents and that role they play in families. Along with that, there would have been very few premarital pregnancies. Most families would have been stable families where the family would have been married, the husband and wife would have been married before there were any children. And we see in this example here in this painting of this idea of this nurturing environment here with Mrs. Elizabeth Freke is the mom, and the baby is baby Mary. So this would have been a Boston mother and child, and it painted in about 1674. And again, this would have been a strong family ties with the mother holding her child. But again, look at that. Look at the images here. So the baby, the child, is dressed kind of like a young adult, a young version of the parent here. So the mother's got a bonnet on her head. The child has a bonnet on her head. Her mother has this brocaded collar. This child has this brocaded collar. The long sleeves with the ribbons. The child has the long sleeves with the ribbons. So whatever the mother's fashion would have been the children's fashion. The idea of play clothes for children was not common at the time and would not have been a concept that doesn't come until much, much later in American history. There's another major difference between New England and the South, and that deals with women's property rights. So in the South, women were more secure in terms of their property rights. And the reason for that was women tend to outlive their husband. So as they outlived their husbands, they inherited the estates. So they would have been the landowners, and they would have been the ones that in Southern society that would have controlled access to the funding. In Puritan New England, they feared that property rights would weaken marriages, so women were forced to give up their property rights when they were married. So if women came in with land or with any kind of property, the husband took over that when the marriage was completed. And so it was a very different way of living in the North and the South in terms of property rights. And we see that illustrated in this painting here. And we see this painting, we see this illustrated in this painting here. Now, this is a famous couple in American history. Looking at the picture here, it's a little difficult to tell, but if you look at the face of this gentleman, you will start to see that that is a young George Washington. So we see a young George Washington here with his wife, Martha. Now, Martha was married prior to her marriage to George. So Martha was married to another man. Her husband, George Custis, I believe was George, I think it was George, died early in their marriage, and these two children would have been the children of that first marriage. So Martha had the estate that George married into. So George really didn't have the money in the family. It would have been Martha's estate that George married into and was able to give him the life of the Virginia planter that he so wanted to be. So we see these property rights playing out in a very big way in terms of the first family of the United States. Continuing back to lives in New England, laws were made to ensure that wives, though, were protected against abusive husbands. So while women had their property rights subsumed by the male, they also sought to protect them in making sure they were not going to be harmed in that marital relationship. There are accounts, for example, of one man who was punished for kicking his wife off a stool. There's another example of a Puritan punishment where a man was punished for drawing an, quote, uncivil portrait of his wife in the snow. So you can imagine what that was like, but he drew this unflattering picture of his wife in the snow, and he would have been put into some kind of stockades, probably, or public shaming among the Puritans for his actions in that area. Women in New England, though, did have a key role, and that key role was being the role of midwives. Midwives are those who are brought in as a woman is going to be having a baby. She's there to help the expectant mother deliver, as at that point in time, the delivering mother bring forth a happy and safe baby. So midwives would have played a key role in New England society because they had the role of power the power of life and death. So their actions there controlled a great deal of life in New England society. They knew the intricacies of childbirth. They were able to help usher in babies and to treat them well at the beginning part of their lives. Laws also protected marriage. The divorce rate was rare, was very, very small in New England because couples were ordered by Puritan society to remain together. There wasn't such a thing as you could just break up because you disagreed with each other. Marriage laws were very much intact to it. There were two things that could lead to a divorce, and that would be the abandonment by either spouse. Now, either spouse could leave, but again, if women left, they had no property with them. If men left, they would often be, again, kind of ostracized from the larger Puritan society. The other way that you would be led to a divorce was through adultery. And adultery was, again, something that was taken seriously, and it was punished in very public ways. One of the ways that we kind of memorialize it in American literature is through the scarlet letter A. So women who were caught in adultery would be forced to wear a embroidered bright red A on all of their clothing. And then we again, next year, when you're in American literature class, you're reading the Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. That's one of the classic works of American literature. It recounts early Puritan society and this whole idea of how these rules were enforced. And one of them was, Hester Prynne is the protagonist in the story, the main character, and she is forced to wear this Scarlet Letter A throughout her life after having committed adultery and then giving birth to her child out of wedlock. New England towns were very tight-knit societies. They were organized well around a center there. The towns were chartered by their colonial leaders, and the leaders then divided up the land among the families and among those settlers there. The towns also had a very practical setup. They would have their meeting house, which would be their place of worship and a place for political discussion. So where they would worship and where they would make decisions for the colony or for the town were in the exact same place. And that would have been on the village green, or it's also called the common, and that would have been the place for the militia to drill. So the forces that would have protected the town against any either foreign, meaning the French in their case, or the Dutch in some southern parts of New England, or in most cases Native American attacks. The militia role would have been to protect them, and so they would have practiced on the village green. And we see that village green here in one great example in the Boston Commons. So this is a very, very large park at the heart of Boston. So on Boston Common, here would be where the Massachusetts State Legislature has their house of government, and other government offices are here. Meanwhile, this big, huge area would have been the Boston Common, and this would have been the grounds on which the militia would have drilled. People would have come out and had picnics. People would have come out and have played on the Boston Commons, and it still exists to this day. We see it from another angle in this picture here. Here is the state legislature today of the state of Massachusetts, and the grounds here. And there's tables for people to picnic on, picnic benches, or for people to sit on, and people just kind of laze themselves out on a beautiful spring morning or fall morning in Boston. Families then would have had parcels of land that would have been very practical. Again, that New England practicality. So the land that would have been divided up, they would have had an area that would have been for wood, for timber, because they needed that for fuel, certainly for their homes. They would have had an area that would have been for farmland to grow their crops, and they would have had an area of the parcel of land for pasture land for their cows or their sheep, for both for if it was for cows, for the milk, for the chickens, for the eggs, for the sheep, for the wool. So again, it would have been a very organized, practical way of living. If a town had 50 or more people, they mandated the town had to provide for elementary education. Again, education was very, very critical and important for Puritan New Englanders. So they mandated that, and in doing so, Puritan New England was the most literate society of its time. And the reason for that underpinning it all is because they had to read the Bible. For Puritans, you had your revelation through reading and pondering on Scripture. The only way that you could read Scripture was if you were literate yourself, so therefore you learned how to read from a very early age. Tied in with that would have been the education, the idea of that. So 1630, we know that the Boston, Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded. Within 6 years, the first university is founded in what is North America, and that is at Harvard University, which still obviously exists today. So 1636, just 6 short years after Massachusetts Bay Colony is founded, the Puritan settlers established Harvard University as a center for higher education in the British colonies. It took another 57 years, which would have been 86 years after Jamestown, for William and Mary to be founded in Virginia. So again, showing this lag in the differential of preferences or of priorities between New England and the South. Within 6 years of founding a colony in New England, they're creating a university. 86 years after founding the colony in Virginia, they're going to found a Massachusetts, or they're going to found a university, which becomes the University of William and Mary. Within New England as well was the Congregational Church. So the South would have been Anglican, but the Congregational Church would have been the church that the Puritan faith eventually morphed into, because again, you were established by congregations, so they renamed themselves to be the Congregational faith. Taxes funded the Congregational Church. All paid taxes to the state regardless of whether or not one belonged. So it went to the state, and then the state funded the churches. And so we call the Congregational Church at this time an established church. So again, kind of put that idea of established churches into your memory bank, because it's going to recycle itself as we continue to talk through the Revolutionary period and when we talk about the framing of the U.S. Constitution. And then an important structure for New England would have been the town meetings, at which all adult males could gather to vote. And they would have elected their leadership. They would have chosen their schoolmasters, and they ran the towns through the town meetings. So that takes care of a comparison between the Southern Society and New England Society. Tomorrow, Wednesday, when we come back, we'll come back and talk about Bacon's Rebellion a little bit more and talk about colonial slavery. and then they'll continue to talk about some of the evolution of colonial America. So take some time to answer the Edpuzzle questions, and if you have any other questions, we'll see you Wednesday. Take care.